The headlines arrived before sunrise, spreading across television screens and mobile phones with astonishing speed. Within minutes, social media was flooded with speculation, royal commentators interrupted their regular programming, and millions of people began asking the same question. What had Prince William discovered that prompted him to prepare an unexpected statement? For years, rumors had surrounded the relationship between the royal family and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, but this time the atmosphere felt different. There was no leaked source, no anonymous palace insider, and no tabloid whisper. Instead, there was only silence from Kensington Palace, and that silence seemed louder than any headline. In this fictional story, the events unfolded on a cold winter morning at Windsor Castle. Prince William had spent the previous evening reviewing briefing papers that covered everything from charitable engagements to constitutional responsibilities. Near the bottom of the final folder rested a sealed envelope marked Private Family Matters. It wasn't unusual for members of the royal family to receive confidential correspondence, but something about this envelope caught William's attention. It carried no official crest and no department reference. Only his name appeared on the front in neat handwriting. He opened it slowly. Inside was a short memorandum prepared by senior advisors following months of discussions about the long-term future of relationships within the royal family. It wasn't written as a legal document or a policy announcement. Instead, it outlined several possible scenarios regarding how future generations of the monarchy might function as public expectations continue to evolve. Among those scenarios was one paragraph that immediately captured William's attention. It suggested that, for the stability of the institution, there should be a permanent distinction between working members of the royal family and relatives who had chosen independent lives abroad. William read the paragraph twice. He wasn't surprised by the recommendation itself. That conversation had quietly existed for years among constitutional advisors. What unsettled him was a realization that the issue could no longer remain theoretical. Time had moved on. New responsibilities were approaching. His father was king, and one day the burden of the crown would fall to him. Difficult questions could no longer be postponed simply because they involved family. Later that morning, William met privately with King Charles. The atmosphere between father and son was respectful but unusually serious. Neither wished to reopen old disagreements, yet both understood that avoiding difficult conversations had solved very little in recent years. Charles poured 2 cups of tea before speaking. "There comes a moment," he said quietly, "when every future monarch must separate personal hopes from constitutional responsibilities." William looked across the room. "Is this about Harry and Meghan?" The king didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the window overlooking the castle grounds. "It's about the future." Those 4 words lingered in the silence. William had always hoped that, despite public disagreements, time might eventually soften old wounds. Families often found unexpected paths toward reconciliation. But governing an ancient institution required decisions based not on emotion alone, but on clarity and consistency. As their conversation continued, Charles emphasized something William hadn't fully considered before. "The public often believes every family disagreement has a simple solution," he said. "Real life rarely offers that luxury." William nodded. He understood better than most that headlines often reduce complicated relationships to heroes and villains. Reality was rarely so straightforward. Later that afternoon, William returned to Kensington Palace, where Catherine noticed immediately that something weighed heavily on his mind. She didn't press him for details. After years in royal life, she knew some conversations required time before they could be shared. Finally, William spoke. "What happens when protecting the institution means accepting that some relationships may never return to what they once were?" Catherine paused thoughtfully. "I don't think protecting the institution and wishing people well have to be opposites." Her answer stayed with him. Compassion didn't always require agreement, nor did distance always require hostility. That evening, William reviewed years of public statements issued by the palace regarding the Sussexes. He noticed a consistent pattern. Every announcement had left room for interpretation. Every sentence carefully avoided permanent conclusions. Perhaps that had been appropriate at the time. But now circumstances were changing. The monarchy was entering a new chapter. The public expected certainty. The institution required stability. Yet William knew one thing above all else. Whatever happened next could never become an attack on Harry or Meghan. If there was difficult news to deliver about the future, it would have to be spoken with dignity, restraint, and respect. Anything less would only deepen divisions that had already lasted far too long. As night settled over London, the lights remained on inside William's study. Drafts of possible statements lay scattered across his desk, each one carefully edited, rewritten, and reconsidered. None of them felt right. Not yet, because the hardest messages are rarely the ones that announce conflict. They are the ones that quietly acknowledge that some chapters have reached their natural ending, however painful that truth may be. The next morning began with another private meeting, this time involving only William, King Charles, and two of the monarchy's most experienced constitutional advisors. The discussion wasn't about personalities or past disagreements. Instead, it focused on the responsibilities of a future king. Every decision made today, they explained, would influence how the institution functioned decades from now. One advisor carefully laid several folders across the polished oak table. "These aren't recommendations about individuals," she said. "They are recommendations about structure." William opened the first folder. It contained summaries of how previous monarchs had managed periods of family tension. Some situations had ended in reconciliation, while others had resulted in permanent changes to royal duties. The lesson repeated throughout history was remarkably consistent. Personal relationships could evolve over time, but constitutional responsibilities required certainty. As William continued reading, another point stood out. The monarchy could survive disagreement. What it struggled with was prolonged uncertainty. That distinction stayed with him. The advisors made no attempt to criticize Harry or Meghan. In fact, one of them spoke warmly about the charitable work both had pursued since stepping away from official royal duties. They acknowledged that meaningful public service could take many different forms. The question, the advisor explained, isn't whether people can contribute to society outside the monarchy. Of course they can. He paused before continuing. The question is whether two separate public roles can continue to be confused. William understood immediately. For years, every public appearance, interview, or news report involving the Sussexes had inevitably been linked back to the royal family. Whether fair or unfair, the association remained powerful. That afternoon, William met privately with Catherine during a walk through the palace gardens. Winter had stripped the trees bare, leaving long paths covered with frost. The quiet surroundings offered a welcome escape from meeting rooms and official papers. "I've been thinking about something," William said. Catherine smiled gently. "I suspected you had. What if the kindest decision isn't the easiest one?" She looked ahead before answering. "Sometimes kindness means giving people the freedom to build separate futures instead of asking everyone to keep waiting for the past." William reflected on her words. They weren't speaking about blame. They were speaking about acceptance. The conversation ended with neither of them claiming to have perfect answers. Yet William felt a growing sense of clarity. Leadership often demanded difficult decisions, but it also demanded compassion. Later that evening, William sat alone in his study reviewing another draft of the statement. The first version sounded too formal. The second felt unnecessarily cold. The third seemed overly emotional. He tore each one apart before starting again. Eventually, he pushed every page aside and began writing from scratch. Not as a future king, not as the Prince of Wales. Simply as a brother who understood that family relationships could become complicated without either side becoming entirely right or entirely wrong. He wrote slowly. "This is not a judgment." He stopped, crossed it out, started again. The future sometimes asks us to accept realities we never wish to face. That sentence remained. Hours passed before another knock interrupted the silence. King Charles entered quietly. "I thought you might still be awake." William smiled faintly. "I haven't found the right words." Charles looked at the unfinished pages. "You know, during my life I discovered something rather uncomfortable." William looked up. "The words themselves are rarely the hardest part." "What is?" "Accepting what those words mean." The two men sat together without speaking for several minutes. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "I've always hoped there might come a day when the whole family could stand together again." William nodded. "So have I." Charles sighed. "Hope is a wonderful thing." Another pause followed. "But institutions cannot be governed by hope alone." William looked toward the window. The lights of London shimmered in the distance. He realized this wasn't simply about Harry or Meghan. It wasn't even about today's headlines. It was about preparing the monarchy for decades that neither he nor his father could fully predict. Before leaving the room, Charles placed a hand on William's shoulder. "Whatever you decide," he said quietly, "make sure history remembers your fairness before it remembers your firmness." Those words stayed with William long after the king had left. Near midnight, he picked up his pen once more. This time the sentences came naturally. There would be no accusations, no personal criticism, no attempt to revisit old disputes. Only an acknowledgement that the paths of the royal family and the Sussexes had grown fundamentally different. If that reality brought sadness, it could also bring peace. Sometimes the most difficult news wasn't that people had become enemies. It was that life had carried them in different directions, and accepting that truth might finally allow everyone involved to move forward with dignity. By the time dawn approached, William placed a final page on top of the finished draft. He wasn't certain how the world would react, but he was certain of one thing. Whatever happened next, he wanted his word to reflect respect rather than resentment, and honesty rather than speculation. The decision was almost ready. Only one final conversation remained before it could be shared. The final conversation took place just after sunrise inside a quiet drawing room at Windsor Castle. There were no cameras waiting outside, no aides filling the room with folders, and no carefully rehearsed speeches. Only King Charles, Prince William, and Catherine sat together as the winter light filtered through the tall windows. The atmosphere was calm, yet everyone understood the importance of the moment. William placed a completed statement on the table. "I've rewritten it 6 times, he admitted with a tired smile. Charles glanced at the pages, and "I finally stopped trying to write what people wanted to hear." Catherine looked at him. "What did you write instead?" William answered without hesitation. "What I believe is fair." Charles slowly picked up the statement and began reading. The room remained silent except for the turning of each page. Every so often he paused, considering a sentence before continuing. When he reached the final paragraph, he carefully folded the document and placed it back on the table. "You've removed every trace of blame." William nodded. That was intentional. Charles looked thoughtful. "People may still read blame into it." "They probably will. And you're prepared for that." William took a slow breath. "I can't control how people interpret my words. I can only control whether those words are honest." For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, Catherine broke the silence. "The hardest part of leadership isn't making difficult decisions." William looked toward her. "It's making them without losing your compassion." Her words seemed to lift some of the weight that had settled over the room. Later that morning, Kensington Palace's communications team gathered to review the final draft before its release. They expected revisions, as was often the case with important statements. Instead, William surprised everyone. There will be no further edits. One advisor hesitated. "Sir, are you certain?" William smiled politely. "If we keep rewriting it, we'll only end up hiding behind softer language." The advisor nodded. Within the hour, preparations were complete. Outside the palace gates, journalists had no idea that an important announcement was only minutes away. Most had gathered expecting routine coverage of William's upcoming charitable engagements. Then, precisely on schedule, the statement appeared across the palace's official channels. Unlike the dramatic headlines that immediately followed, the wording itself was measured and restrained. It acknowledged that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex had established independent lives and independent public roles. It recognized their freedom to pursue their own charitable and professional work while confirming that the structure of the modern monarchy would continue to rely on those serving as working members of the royal family. The statement ended with a sentence that immediately captured public attention. "We sincerely wish the Duke and Duchess every success in the future, while recognizing that our respective paths now remain separate." That single sentence quickly became the focus of international discussion. Some commentators described it as heartbreaking. Others called it realistic. Many noticed what the statement did not include. There were no accusations or no criticism, no references to past interviews, disagreements, or family tensions. Only a quiet acceptance that the future would look different from what many had once imagined. Within minutes, television networks interrupted their programming. Royal experts debated every line. Newspapers rushed to update their front pages. Across social media, millions shared their own opinions. Some believed William had finally brought clarity. Others hoped reconciliation might still happen privately one day. Neither interpretation changed the statement itself. Its purpose had never been to predict the future. Its purpose had been to define the present. That afternoon, William carried on with a previously scheduled visit to a children's hospice. As he greeted families, laughed with young patients, and spoke with volunteers, reporters noticed something unexpected. He refused to discuss the statement. When one journalist asked whether he regretted releasing it, William simply smiled. Today is about these remarkable children. Then he walked inside. Those watching understood the message immediately. Life continued. Public service continued. The work that mattered most continued. Meanwhile, news of the statement spread around the world. Supporters of every viewpoint debated its meaning, yet one fact remained unchanged. The palace had not declared winners or losers. It had simply acknowledged that different choices had led to different futures. That evening, William returned home. George, Charlotte, and Louis greeted him with the excitement only children can bring. They had little interest in constitutional questions or international headlines. They wanted to show him drawings they had made that afternoon. William smiled. For the first time in several days, the pressure seemed to disappear. As he watched his children laughing together, he quietly reflected on everything that had happened. The future wasn't built only through official statements. It was built through ordinary moments, through kindness, through responsibility, through the example parents set every single day. Later that night, standing beside the window overlooking the quiet gardens, Catherine joined him. "Do you think people will understand?" William looked out into the darkness before answering. "Some will. And those who don't." He smiled gently. "They're entitled to their opinions." He paused. "My responsibility isn't to convince everyone I'm right. It's to make decisions I can live with." Catherine reached for his hand. Neither of them spoke again. Sometimes silence carried more meaning than words ever could. As the lights of Windsor Castle reflected across the winter sky, William knew the public conversation would continue for weeks, perhaps even months. But inside the palace, a sense of certainty had finally replaced years of uncertainty. Not because every disagreement had been solved, not because every relationship had been repaired, but because difficult realities had finally been acknowledged with dignity rather than anger. And perhaps, in time, that quiet honesty will become the first step toward a more peaceful future for everyone involved, even if they walk that future on separate paths. As the days passed, the initial wave of headlines slowly gave way to reflection. Television debates became less heated. Newspaper editorials shifted toward broader questions about the future of the monarchy, and the public's attention gradually moved beyond the announcement itself. Yet for those closest to the royal family, the statement had marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. In this fictional story, Meghan found herself sitting quietly on the terrace of a California home as the evening sun disappeared beyond the hills. The phone had finally stopped ringing. Friends had offered encouragement. Advisors had discussed media strategies, and countless opinions had filled television screens throughout the day. For the first time in hours, there was silence. Harry stepped outside carrying 2 cups of tea. Neither spoke immediately. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations begin without words. After several minutes, Harry finally broke the silence. "Do you regret any of it?" Meghan looked toward the horizon before answering. "I regret that things became so painful." She paused. "But I don't regret believing we could build a different life." Harry nodded thoughtfully. He understood the distinction. Regret and acceptance could exist together. One did not erase the other. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, William was preparing for another full week of public engagements. Schools, hospitals, environmental projects, and charitable organizations filled his diary exactly as they had before the announcement. One of his private secretaries noticed something unusual. "The media is still asking for interviews about yesterday." William smiled politely. "They'll have to keep asking." "You don't intend to respond?" "No." The secretary looked surprised. "Why not?" William closed the folder in front of him. "Because leadership isn't measured by how long you continue talking about a difficult decision." He stood. "It's measured by whether you continue doing the work afterward." Those words quietly spread through the palace, not as an official slogan, simply as a reminder that public service remained the institution's primary purpose. Across the Atlantic, Meghan reached a similar conclusion. Instead of allowing herself to become consumed by endless commentary, she turned her attention toward projects she believed could make a genuine difference. Meetings with charitable organizations resumed. Creative work that had been postponed returned to the calendar. New opportunities emerged, not because of royal connections, but because she and Harry had chosen to build independent careers. One evening, a close friend asked her a question many people had wondered privately. If the door ever reopened, would you go back? Meghan smiled gently. I don't think life works that way. The answer surprised her friend. We spend too much time trying to recreate the past. She continued quietly. Sometimes a healthier choice is to create a future that doesn't depend on reopening old doors. Far away in Britain, William found himself thinking about remarkably similar words. During a visit to a youth leadership program, a teenager asked him an unexpected question. How do you move forward after making a decision that not everyone agrees with? The room became completely silent. William considered the question carefully. You listen. He smiled. You learn. And then you continue trying to serve with integrity. The audience applauded, not because the answer solved every disagreement, but because it reflected something people rarely heard from public figures. Humility. As spring slowly approached, life settled into a new rhythm. The royal family continued its constitutional role. Harry and Meghan continued building their lives overseas. Public attention gradually shifted toward new events, new stories, and new challenges. The fierce debates that had once dominated headlines slowly became part of history. Looking back, William realized something important. The most difficult news he had ever delivered hadn't been tragic, because it involved anger. It had been tragic because it acknowledged that love between family members doesn't always prevent people from choosing different paths. Families can disagree. Families can grow apart. Yet hope for kindness never has to disappear. Months later, during a private family dinner, King Charles quietly reflected on everything that had happened. We often imagine history is written by dramatic moments, he said. William listened. But more often, Charles continued, history is written by how people behave after those moments have passed. William thought about those words long after the evening ended. The announcement itself would eventually become just another page in history books. What truly mattered was what came afterward. Would people choose bitterness? Or would they choose dignity? Would they remain trapped by yesterday? Or would they begin building tomorrow? In this fictional story, the answer came not through another royal statement, but through ordinary acts of service performed quietly on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Different lives, different responsibilities, different futures, yet each moving forward in their own way. As another year drew closer, William stood outside Windsor Castle watching the evening sky fade into darkness. He thought briefly of his mother, whose compassion had inspired millions. He thought of his father, who carried the burden of the crown. He thought of Harry, whose childhood memories would always be intertwined with his own. And yes, he thought of Meghan, not as a headline or controversy, but as someone whose life had become part of the family's complicated story. Some stories end with dramatic reunions. Others end with permanent separation. But the wisest endings are often neither. They are the moments when people finally accept reality with grace, stop trying to rewrite the past, and begin living the future they have. As the castle lights illuminated the courtyard below, William quietly turned back toward the palace. Tomorrow would bring another engagement, another speech, another opportunity to serve. The headlines would eventually fade. Opinions would continue to differ. History would make its own judgments. But one lesson would remain. The true measure of leadership is not found in winning every argument. It is found in choosing respect when disagreement feels easier, dignity when emotion runs high, and responsibility when the weight of duty demands difficult choices. And perhaps that, more than any statement ever released, would become the legacy people remembered. The future had arrived. It looked different than anyone once imagined, but it was a future each person now had the freedom and the responsibility to shape for themselves.